How does a vehicle earn crash protection Mercedes wouldn't require for another decade, then vanish from showrooms in barely 15 years? In 1963, the Rover P6 arrived with a steel safety cage, crumple zones front and rear, and a firewall engineered to drop the engine downward on impact, advances most European rivals lacked until the 1970s. Awards came first, and imitators followed, but here's the harder truth. The very company that built this machine slowly starved it. Drop your city below before we go any further. Let's see how far this reaches. A company eating its own creation. That's the question waiting to be answered. First, the proof behind the title's promise, because none of this holds up without it. Britain in the early 1960s built cars the way it had for decades. Separate chassis, thin steel panels, an engine bolted in front of a driver who had almost nothing protecting them if things went wrong. Crash testing barely existed as a formal discipline. Seatbelts weren't standard equipment anywhere in the mass market. Nobody engineered a car to fail safely, because nobody expected buyers to demand it. Rover's engineers ignored that expectation entirely. Working under a design led by Spen King and Gordon Bashford, the team built the P6 around what they called a base unit construction, a rigid steel cage forming the passenger compartment, with front and rear sections designed to crumple and absorb impact rather than transmit it straight into the cabin. Mercedes-Benz was pursuing similar ideas around the same period, but almost nobody else in the industry took the concept this seriously, and certainly not at Rover's price point. Here's a detail worth sitting with. In a severe frontal collision, the P6's firewall was designed to let the engine drop downward and slide beneath the passenger footwell instead of crushing into it. Picture that moment. A wall of steel absorbing an impact that, in nearly every rival car of the era, would have sent the engine block straight into the driver's legs. Rover's engineers had essentially built an escape hatch for the one component that could kill you fastest. Padding lined the dashboard. Inertia reel seatbelts came fitted front and rear, years before legislation forced most manufacturers to bother. A small prism of glass sat above each front side light, letting drivers judge the car's corner in darkness. A tiny, almost invisible fix for a real, everyday danger nobody else had solved yet. Awards followed quickly. Industry recognition for the P6's safety engineering arrived almost as soon as journalists finished testing it, and reviewers openly struggled to name a direct competitor. This wasn't a family saloon wearing safety features as decoration. It was a car built from the inside out around the idea that a crash shouldn't be a death sentence. Something bigger is still hiding underneath all of this, though, and it has nothing to do with crumple zones. The same suspension that made the P6 feel planted and composed on a wet road carried a secret purpose most owners never suspected. Engineers had deliberately built extra width into the engine bay, space no four-cylinder motor of the era actually needed. Why design that kind of room into a family car when every ounce of unused space costs money and weight? Inside Rover's own experimental workshops, years before the P6 ever reached a showroom, sat the answer. Radial tires tell part of this story too. The P6 became the first British-built car sold with radial tires fitted as standard, a technology that improved grip, stability, and tire life dramatically over the cross-ply designs still common on rival cars. Buyers rarely notice this detail on a spec sheet. Drivers absolutely notice the difference on a wet motorway at speed. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened cheaply. Every safety feature, every radial tire, every inch of unexplained width under that bonnet cost Rover money it didn't strictly need to spend to sell a competent family car. A company chasing quarterly profit doesn't usually build a firewall designed to save a stranger's legs in a crash nobody's had yet. So why did Rover spend it anyway? The mystery behind that engine bay isn't a throwaway detail. It's the key to understanding just how far ahead of the industry this small British company was thinking, and how much that ambition would eventually cost. Under that bonnet, the unexplained width wasn't a mistake. It was a bet on an engine Rover never actually finished selling. Turbine power obsessed a small circle of engineers at Rover throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, long before the P6 existed on paper. Jet engines had transformed aviation within a single generation, and Rover's engineers wondered, with genuine seriousness, whether the same technology could transform the family car. Spinning turbines instead of pistons, no pistons to wear out, fewer moving parts, smoother power delivery than anything a conventional engine could match. A prototype called the T4 emerged from this obsession in 1961, 2 years before the P6 reached production. Front-engined, front-wheel drive, and powered entirely by a gas turbine, the T4 previewed the styling that would eventually define the P6's exterior. Engineers weren't simply testing a new powertrain, they were designing an entire car around the idea that turbines, not pistons, represented the honest future of everyday driving. Consider what that ambition actually demanded of the rest of the car. A gas turbine engine runs wider and shorter than a conventional four-cylinder unit, and it needs generous airflow to function properly. So when Rover's engineers designed the P6's front suspension, they built in exactly that kind of room, sacrificing conventional layout logic for a power plant that hadn't even reached production yet. The unusual bell crank suspension design, springs mounted horizontally against the bulkhead instead of sitting vertically over the wheels, existed specifically to clear space for a turbine that might arrive within a few short years. If you're the kind of viewer who enjoys watching an engineering gamble unfold in real time, stick with this one, because the payoff and the loss both land harder than you'd expect. Consider subscribing now, since stories like this one, forgotten ambition hiding under an ordinary badge, are exactly what this channel digs up every week. Rover kept testing. The company entered turbine-powered prototypes in endurance races through the early 1960s, chasing proof that the technology could survive real-world punishment, not just laboratory conditions. A turbine-powered car even completed the Le Mans 24 Hours, an achievement that briefly made Rover's experimental workshop the most talked-about corner of British motorsport. None of that translated into a production turbine engine reaching customers, though, and the reasons were unglamorous. Fuel consumption stayed brutally high compared to a piston engine. Turbines also needed exotic, expensive materials to survive the extreme heat inside them, and manufacturing costs never came close to matching what an ordinary family buyer could afford to pay. Rover's engineers had solved the glamorous half of the problem. The unglamorous half, cost and thirst, refused to cooperate. By 1966, 3 years after the P6 reached showrooms, Rover quietly shelved the gas turbine program altogether. No press conference marked the decision. No dramatic announcement explained to buyers why their family saloon still carried a suspension designed around an engine it would never receive. The program simply stopped, its budget redirected, its engineers reassigned to problems that could actually turn a profit. Picture an engineer walking past that oversized engine bay years later, knowing exactly what it was built to hold, and knowing it would never hold it. The P6 kept selling anyway, its four-cylinder engine perfectly adequate, its suspension quietly overbuilt for a future that had already been canceled. Buyers driving it to work never suspected they were piloting a car engineered around a dream someone else had already abandoned. This wasn't Rover's only ambitious swing, though, and it wasn't the last time the company's own reach would outpace what its budget could actually support. A pattern was forming, one that had nothing to do with rival manufacturers and everything to do with decisions made inside Rover's own boardroom. That pattern is about to become impossible to ignore. Years before British Leyland even existed, that pattern had already begun, with the very engineering that made the P6 remarkable in the first place. Safety frame thinking, once locked inside the P6, didn't stay there for long. By 1970, the same base unit philosophy, the same instinct toward a rigid passenger cell wrapped in a body built for durability over decoration, had shaped an entirely new vehicle, the Range Rover. Engineers who'd spent years refining the P6's structure carried that knowledge directly into Rover's next big idea, and the company poured fresh investment into making sure it succeeded. Here's the detail that changes how this story reads. The Range Rover used a similar base unit construction to the P6's, borrowed permanent four-wheel drive thinking from Rover's own experimental work, and launched into a market with almost no direct competition. It became an instant commercial phenomenon, praised by critics and copied by rivals within a decade. Every ounce of engineering brilliance that had once defined the P6 now had a newer, shinier home. The P6 itself got something very different: less. In 1967, Rover merged into the Leyland Motor Corporation, and 2 years later that corporation merged again into British Leyland, a conglomerate now managing dozens of brands under one increasingly strained roof. Suddenly, the P6 wasn't just competing against Ford and Mercedes for buyers. It was competing against its own sibling for investment, attention, and factory space. The Triumph 2000, built by a rival firm that British Leyland had also just absorbed, occupied nearly identical market territory, chasing nearly identical customers inside the very same company. Picture a boardroom meeting somewhere inside British Leyland's sprawling new structure, executives staring at two competent, well-engineered saloons that were quietly cannibalizing each other's sales instead of anyone else's. Nobody had planned this collision. It happened because two independent companies, each proud of its own engineering, had been forced under one badge without anyone deciding which car should actually win. Neither car received the investment it needed to pull decisively ahead. Development budgets stretched thinner every year, split across a growing list of models the parent company now had to support simultaneously. The P6 that had once justified an entire safety engineering department now had to fight for scraps against a sibling built by people who'd been rivals just a few years earlier. Consider what that meant for the car itself. Updates slowed. The bold ambition that had produced a turbine-ready suspension and a dropping firewall gave way to smaller, cheaper revisions, the kind a starved engineering team could actually afford. The P6 remained a genuinely good car right up until its final year, but genuinely good wasn't the same standard it had set for itself back in 1963. Production ended in 1977, and its replacement, the Rover SD1, arrived carrying real ambition of its own, but without the singular focus that had defined the P6's original design brief. British Leyland had bigger, messier problems by then: labor disputes, quality control failures, and a portfolio too large for any single company to manage properly were already consuming attention that once might have gone toward refining one exceptional saloon. Here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of it. No rival manufacturer beat the P6 on merit. No single flaw doomed it. The company that built a car ahead of Mercedes on safety, ahead of the industry on radial tires, bold enough to design a suspension around an engine that didn't exist yet, slowly reassigned its best ideas and its sharpest engineers to newer projects, then buried the P6 in a structure built to manage decline rather than ambition. It didn't lose the P6 to a competitor. Rover lost it to itself, one redirected engineer and one starved development budget at a time. That firewall, that suspension built for a turbine, that safety cage decades early, none of it vanished. It's driving around today, inside every Range Rover on the road. Rover didn't lose to a rival, it lost pieces of itself to its own family. Which forgotten British car got cannibalized next? Tell me below.